Good morning, everybody. This is another episode of Morning Jim. I'm now back in Topeka, Kansas at my villa apartment in what is called the Cottonwood Building. And I'm glad to be home, but I'm missing my family back in Pennsylvania, where I was at the time of my previous programs. As you know, I'm just trying to get this thing going. It's not the easiest thing to do for an oldster like myself to manipulate all these electronic gadgets, including the microphone, which is out of your view. But I think I've got it, sort of like the heroine in My Fair Lady. I think you've got it. I think I've got it. We'll see. I'm sitting at the end of my dining table with my photographs that are on display on the wall behind me from various trips that Marcia and I took to Italy and to England and to Scotland. Pictured partially or entirely behind you. And as you'll see, I've got my robe and my scarf on because it is a chilly morning here in Topeka, 48 degrees. It's October 1st. I think that's a good time to do a new program, October 1st. And I have two poems for you this morning. The first is by one of my favorite poets when I was in college, John Crowe, Ransom. Now, before you get too excited, I just want you to know that I am not a descendant of that august and very famous poet and literary critic who was a professor at Kenyon College for many, many years. That was a different branch of the Ransom family. And I like John Crowe Ransom's poems because they sort of resonate with a Southern mood and mode. You can't read them without falling into a slight Southern accent. That's how well constructed they are. You can't help yourself. The first poem is called Here Lies a Lady. This poem was first published in Ransom's Poems and Essays way back in 1945 when he was just getting started. And Here Lies a Lady was revised much later, 20 years later, and he removed a few words and changed some phrases, so he has both an A and a B version. I'm reading the A version, the first version, which I frankly think is quite a bit better than the B version. I think his critical acumen got in the way of his poetry at a certain point. So here's version A of Here Lies a Lady. Here lies a lady of beauty in high degree. Of chills and fever she died, of fever and chills. The delight of her husband, an aunt, an infant of 3, and of medicos, marveling sweetly on her ills. For either she burned and her confident eyes would blaze, and her fingers fly in a manner to puzzle their heads. What was she making? Why, nothing. She sat in a maze of old scraps of laces snipped into curious shreds. Or this would pass, and the light of her fire decline, till she lay discouraged and cold, like a thin stalk, white and blown, and would not open her eyes to kisses, to wine. The sixth of these states was her last. The cold settled down. Sweet ladies, long may ye bloom, and toughly I hope ye may thole, but was she not lucky? In flowers and lace and mourning, in love and great honor we bade God rest her soul. After 6 little spaces of chill and 6 of burning. A few comments on that poem might be appropriate. You'll notice that in one of the lines from stanza 3, he forsakes the iambic pentameter and went into a line of hexameter. I mean, I love that. I think poems can be pretty boring if at some point the rhythm doesn't syncopate a little bit. But more to the point, this is a poem about death. And in this poem, we see a woman who is wealthy, who has a husband and family. She's not too old, but she's dying. And the doctors of her time cannot help her. This is a sad situation, but in a way, in the last stanza, we get the ironic point of the poem. But was she not lucky? In flowers and lace and mourning, in love and great honor, we bade God rest her soul, after 6 little spaces of chill and 6 of burning. She's much better off than the people who suffer and die from the COVID virus in abandoned corners of hospitals or nursing homes where their relatives cannot visit them. She's much better off than the child on a tricycle struck down in the middle of a street by a drunken driver. She's much better off than the sad soul wasting away with Alzheimer's. I mean, we are to get the impression that since life is finite and we all have to die, perhaps this sweet lady and other sweet ladies are a lot better off to die in flowers and lace and mourning, in love and great honor, than in the many more horrible ways we have discovered for this to happen. Okay, that's the commentary. Now I'm going to go to a poem with a little more, perhaps a little lighter touch to it. This is a poem by another Ransom, me, and it's from my book, Immortal Prairie. In fact, it's the last poem on the last page of that weighty tome. It's called The Lemonade Man, 1863, Great-Grandfather at the White House. Guarding the White House were these volunteers in dark blue wool and bucktail garlands on their forage caps. They stood their ground in the full sun of that perilous summer and marched off late in the day to the sound of taps. The sweat and stink were pretty bad, but compared to marching with the Army of the Potomac down in the swamps of the James with the heat and cholera, they said, it was a hell of a lot better to be in this capital town, in spite of the heavy muskets carrying cartridges with 50 caliber lead. Ambassadors stepping from carriages, cabinet members frowning, hairy, Seward, and officers from the Army staff. In and out of the White House, early and late, they saw them all. Some days they had receptions, and the riffraff even stole pieces of the president's carpet. Quite a haul. The president, old Abe himself, saw the troopers sweltering, and taking off his tall beaver, wiped his brow, remembering past years splitting wood and digging ditches, and then loped back inside right then and now, reappearing with the help, carrying large pitchers of iced lemonade. Christ, what a break to come our way. The Pennsylvania men cheered the president. It was a survivor's war for Sam Ransom, a sweet tale and a lucky day. In that poem, I'm trying to give a little bit of family history, and it would be good if you had a background in reading a little bit about the Civil War, and I hope if you haven't done that, that this will encourage you to do so, because you'll understand a little bit better about the situation at that time. Remember, there was no air conditioning in the White House or anyplace else. And the soldiers wore wool uniforms, even in the summertime. And if you know anything about Washington, D.C., it gets just about as hot as hell. Maybe that's why the bureaucrats are pretty sour, especially this past summer. It hasn't done them any good, even with air conditioning. And of course, in the days of the Civil War, the soldiers were carrying heavy muskets and cartridges with .50 caliber lead. Anybody who's carried .50 caliber lead cartridges, I have, will know that a whole package of them would be pretty heavy. And the reference to frowning Harry Seward, Harry meaning H-A-I-R-Y, Seward was one of Lincoln's cabinet members, a man who always thought of himself as being a really good option for president. But he was also a very wise and hardworking Secretary of War, and Lincoln valued his advice. So these are the poems for today. They're not alike, but they both have messages, one about life and death, and the other about history and life outside our own narrow spectrum of time. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a little commentary on this cup from which I'm drinking a wonderful coffee that I have every morning. It's 100% Colombian coffee, and I have a device called Nespresso frother, and it warms and froths skim milk, and then you can put a heavy layer of it on top of the coffee, and you can have a homemade latte. Save yourself $2 or $3 every day with that concoction, and it's wonderful tasting. But the mug that I'm drinking it out of was a gift from my daughter Laurel when I was visiting her in Pittsburgh, and it's a little lecture in Pittsburghese, the language of the Pittsburghers, who came to make steel and other dirty jobs during the peak of the Industrial Revolution in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's the place where the Monongahela River joins another river, I can't remember the name of it, to form the Ohio River, on which Lincoln and many, many other farmers of the time took loads of goods down to the Mississippi and thence on down to New Orleans. If you've read Mark Twain's books, of course, I don't think that Huckleberry Finn is allowed to be read by any of the poor, abused students of today, but in it, you'll read about a trip down the Mississippi. And a lot of the goods that came down the Mississippi started in Pittsburgh. And the Pittsburgh people came from all over Europe. There were Italians and Slovenians and Poles and all sorts of settlers from the European Netherlands. And they sort of developed their own version of English. And my mother's young gardener was from Pittsburgh, and my daughter's gardener in this day and age is a Pittsburgher. And these people are called Yinzers. And they have their own sort of language. For example, if they're going to go down to the main strip, they call it downtown. And iron is arn. And a rubber band is not a rubber band, it's a gum band. And if they don't like you, you're a jagoff, which is a jerk. When it gets to be supper time, you might hear them asking, "Jeet jet? Jeet jet?" That means, did you eat yet? And if they're giving you a list of things, when they come near the end of it, they'll say, "Nat." Nat, which means, and so forth. And if you ask too many questions, they'll say, "You're a bit nebby," meaning nosy. And Laurel's gardener frequently will say, "Well, Laurel, I'm here to red up." And what he means by that is to tidy up the garden, red up. And there's more, but that's Yinzer talk. And it's fun to go to Pittsburgh, where even in this day and age with all the television and so on, and of course in Pittsburgh, they don't watch much television except for the Steelers, and incidentally, they're called the Stillers, and the hockey team, and the Pittsburgh Pirate baseball team. So they don't necessarily learn the rest of the modern English language, and in some ways they're better off, I think. Okay, everybody, that's it for this episode of Morning Jim. I hope you like the poetry. I'll be back next week to read some more, and maybe even earlier if I get myself all read up for my time here in Topeka. All right, we're ready to go, so goodbye to all of you, and I hope you had some fun.